Please be turning with me to Revelation chapter 18 as we continue our study in this section of Revelation. We're talking about the judgment on Babylon. And again, in the usage of the apocalyptic language that is manifest within this context, it's come to the point that these people are being encouraged by the knowledge that, yes, Babylon will be dealt with. And that Babylon that he's talking about here, of course, as we have noted, is Rome. And when we think about the judgment of Babylon, this is not something that just affects Rome. But what he's telling them here is that it affects all of those areas, all of those countries that have, in essence, as we note, who have committed acts of immorality with her. Verse 2, chapter 18. So there were those that were not happy with the situation in Rome. They were not happy of being under the burden of Rome, but yet that was where the wealth was. And because the wealth was in Rome, they were trying to make all that they could from it. In other words, they were making a better situation after a bad idea or a bad deal. And that was being connected with Rome and the situation that was going on there. I would like for you, if we may, to back up in our reading tonight and note in chapter 18, verse 9, it says, "And the kings of the earth who committed acts of immorality and lived sensuously with her will weep and lament over her when they see the smoke of her burning, standing at a distance because of the fear of her torment, saying, Woe, woe, the great city, Babylon, the strong city, for in 1 hour your judgment has come." You know, when we think about that situation, it was an instantaneous judgment. They're going to fall. It's going to be real. Again, apocalyptic language is being utilized here, not physical language, but the idea that it's going to fall and God's going to deal with Rome because of their persecution of the church and those individuals therein. Now, I want you to note, and this is what is getting us down as we get into verse 17, is that the merchants of the earth are the ones that are going to be drastically concerned. Let's look at verse 11 quickly. It says, "And the merchants of the earth weep and mourn over her." And he gives the reason. "Because no one buys their cargoes anymore." They lost their business. And of course, it enumerates going down verses 12 through 13 about some of the things that was the merchandise that they were selling. Well, what Rome had done not only affected them, but also all these other merchants, all these other countries, all these struggles. Now, as we get down to verse 15, it says, "The merchants of these things who became rich from her will stand at a distance because of fear of her torment, weeping and moaning, saying, Woe, woe, the great city, she who was clothed in fine linen and purple and scarlet and adorned with gold and precious stones and pearls, for in 1 hour such great wealth has been laid waste. And every shipmaster and every passenger and sailor and as many as make their living of the sea stood at a distance." And they were crying out as they saw the smoke of her burning, saying, what city is like the great city? There's kind of a unique thought beginning there in verse 15 and going down to verse 18. It's being noted that whenever Rome does fall, that all of these outside entities, these countries, these merchants, what do they do? Do they come to Rome's assistance? No, they stood apart. They were standing outside and looking inside while Rome burned, and they were more concerned about themselves as Rome burning. And that's kind of what we get to as we go into verse 19. It says that they threw dust upon their heads and were crying out, weeping and mourning, saying, woe, woe, the great city in which all who had ships at the sea became rich by her wealth, for in 1 hour she had been laid waste. They were concerned about their own financial situation. And you know, that's a reality that has been throughout the ages. Is we didn't like Rome, but yet that's where we got our wealth, that's where we got our money. And when it was gone, they were fretting it. Let's just put it that way. Well, when we think about this, the shipmasters and the sailors who bought goods from afar, there was nowhere to offload their cargo. The city was not able to buy it. There was would be there was no other market to take their place. And in that materialism and the worship of things, that kind of destruction brought concern for those in the outlying area. The city, again, as I noted just a moment ago, was noted as being laid waste in 1 hour. When Nero set Rome afire, it took a week and failed to destroy the entire city. Yet the fire that God sent destroyed the city in 1 hour. It was very quickly and it was gone. Now, this dirge, and we talked about the dirges in our last lesson, and this is one of the dirges, and it goes back to Ezekiel chapter 27, going down to verse 28, or verse 27, excuse me. It says, your wealth, your wares, your merchandise, your sailors and your pilots, your repairs of seams, your dwellers in merchant, or your dealers in merchandise, and all your men of war who are in you, with all your company that is in your midst, will fall into the heart of the sea on the day of your overthrow. At the sound of the cry of your pilots, the pasture lands will shake. All who handle the oar, the sailor and all the pilots of the sea will come down from their ships and will stand on the land. And they will make their voices heard over you. And they will cry bitterly. And they will cast dust on their heads. And they will wallow in ashes. In essence, this situation is that, oh, woe is me, we don't have any way to make our money and make a living. Why? Because God is dealing with Rome. Well, what had the Romans been doing to the children to the Christians? Well, starving them. And what goes around, in essence, is going to come around. As we look down in verse 20, it says, rejoice over her, O heaven, and you saints and apostles, because God has pronounced judgment against her, or judgment for you against her. Well, they had been crying out for judgment. You know, back in chapter 11, the wicked on earth had mocked the death of the two witnesses, but now the tables are turned. The people of God are not told to rejoice in death. but they do find satisfaction in the defeat of evil by good. And I would suggest we see that in our own world today. But while the kings and the merchants and the sailors mourn and weep, the saints, the apostles, the prophets celebrate, for the persecution have been avenged, and it was over. Now, we know that Rome lasted 600 years. This was written in the first century. So there was about 500 years of persecution, or at least maybe not 500 years. I think it was about let me think quickly, get my brain to work. About 300 years in total before Christianity was accepted in Rome. Rome's judgment is cause for rejoicing. Of course, God's people reject a requested judgment. God delivered it. The righteous are victorious. The evil has been defeated. Rome was rejoicing in chapter 11 when it appeared that the two witnesses had been defeated. But their rejoicing was premature, and now the tables turn. Again, we find a parallel in the Old Testament over in Jeremiah 51 in verse 48, where it says, "Then the heaven and earth and all that is in them shall sing for joy over Babylon. For the destroyer shall come against them out of the north, says the Lord." So it's not the problems that the people are facing, but that evil is gone. It's out of the world. The persecution is set aside. So it notes here, "But I thought we were supposed to weep with those who have wept." Well, that is true. But also not doing out of personal bitterness. Their concern that of the four living creatures is that the holiness and the reputation of God. They rejoice at the vindication of God and the defeat of the great enemy of God. This is an answer to their prayers. They rejoice that evil was taken care of. And that was the sentence that was passed on Rome. And going on down to verse 21. It says, "Then a strong angel took up a stone like a great millstone and threw it into the sea, saying, So will Babylon, the great city, be thrown down with violence and will not be found any longer. And the sound of harpists and musicians and flute players and trumpeters will not be heard in you any longer. And no craftsman of any craft will be found in you any longer. And the sound of a mill will not be heard in you any longer. And the light of a lamp will not shine in you any longer. And the voice of the bridegroom, the bride, will not be heard in you any longer. And your merchants were the great men of the earth, because all the nations were deceived by your sorcery. And in her was found the blood of prophets and of saints and of all who have been slain on the earth." The angel cast a millstone into the sea. And that illustrates the rippling effect of Rome's fall. And that gets back to the idea with the merchants. You know, what happened to Rome went out. It was this mighty angel casting this down, and they would be found no more. And here's all these people from the Mediterranean and outside the Mediterranean. They went all the way from India, all the way to Great Britain and the British Isles. It was a big thing. The Roman Empire went all the way to Germany, all across North Africa, all the Middle East. It was all in the power of Rome. And probably billions of people And when Rome falls, it's over. And why did they fall? Because they persecuted the church. And we know that Christianity was legalized before its complete fall in the 600s. But the thing about it is, it was still perverted in that situation when it was even legalized. We find this similar image in Jeremiah 51, going down to verse 36 or 63 and 64, where it says, "When you finish reading this book, bind a stone to it and cast it in the midst of the Euphrates and say, 'Thus shall Babylon sink, to rise no more because of the evil that I will bring upon her.'" And you know, the Roman Empire has not rose again. Whenever it fell, it was over. It's no longer and has not been any longer. Babylon's the same reality. Rome, like Babylon, would fall and never to rise again. So it was done. It was completed. It was over. In verses 22 through 23 shows us 5 aspects of normal Roman life that would vanish. Things were going to change, and they did. And as we have studied and read and looked at, whenever Rome fell, they were also attacked by several outside entities or nations, anywhere from the ones to the east to the Huns and many others. Went and just destroyed the place. So it was not a good thing. It notes here in verses 22 and 23, the sound of musical instruments and rejoicing would go away. And I guess we could call Rome kind of one of those party towns. There was a lot of parties going on, for a better word, festivals and all of those kinds of things. And whenever you think about the pagan temples and all the pagan goings on, all the people coming in and out of Rome from other places, it was quite a party town. Well, that was going to be over. The sound of craftsmen plying their trade would never be heard again. And the craftsmen of Rome there would be no business. They would be gone. And think about the joy that people had before the persecution of Rome to Christians. They would have been joyful. They'd have been plying their trade. But when people, these 7 churches of Asia, become Christians, they couldn't ply their trade any longer. The sound of the mill would disappear. You know, I think about that right there, and I think about how that in our world today, our cotton gins are gone. Y'all remember the racket them things made? They'd be sitting over there roaring and roaring and roaring, and people be going in and out of there. And now all we see is a truck come along and pick up the bales of cotton and tote them off somewhere. We don't know where, but somewhere. Maybe to Texas. I don't know. They send them off somewhere. Well, what happened whenever the cotton gins disappeared? People didn't get jobs. The gins, the cotton, and all that was a big thing in this area. No lights in the house or in the streets would be seen. Now remember, some of these things that were imported was for lighting. We have people today who are concerned about import of fuels. And without the import of fuels, they have what? No light. No way to get around, none of those things. And I don't know. I kind of like it when the lights go out, except that the roar across the road, because their lights don't go out. You know, they got one of those automatic come on generators. Yeah, well, you know how that is. Anyway, Linda said, "Don't you get off on that, John." But, you know, after a while, Linda says, "Man, I sure would like to have some water." So, Praise the Lord, we can get water. But the lights are gone. You can't see. The streets would be dark. The sound of weddings would no longer be heard. There would be no things like that. That would be a joyful occasion. Rome is to become a dark, silent, and dark desolation. You go back and you read in the Old Testament, it talks a lot about whenever one of these cities fall, that there's nothing left. And if I'm contemplating correctly, for forever, Babylon, there was nothing there, and they never rebuilt any of it. I would suggest that Rome has been rebuilt, but not in the same ideology or the same way as it was before it did fall. It also notes here that Rome, which had once set Christians aflame to provide light for Nero's drunken orgies, would be plunged into darkness and silence. There would be no more of those kind of things going on. You know, Nero was nuts. I mean, you can't say it. He was nuts. And he did some horrible things. As a matter of fact, some believe that he was probably mentally impaired. He was so crazy. And he lit the Appian Road, which is the road going into Rome, with the bodies of Christians, and set afire. And they were set afire on spikes just to light it. Now, you light a whole road like that, it's miles. How many people was he murdering just to do that? And then I think about what was going on in the Colosseum. And I would suggest that what they have on TV these days, that they had these gladiators, and they were all tough. And no, they were just folks. They would throw people into the Colosseum to be murdered, to be torn apart by animals. It was horrific, and they did that for entertainment. Think about how terrible that was. Well, it notes here, this is going to be gone. We're not going to do that anymore. We're not taking people to the Colosseum. We're not burning bodies to light Nero's drunken orgies, which was part of their religion, those kind of things. If you ever go back and you study about the Roman emperors and their immorality, it's horrendous. But the same kind of stuff's going on in our world today that was going on there. But again, in chapter 18 of Revelation, this is an encouragement to say, look, all this stuff you're seeing going on is going to come to an end. It's going to stop. So why did this happen? Well, the merchants were great men. We find 3 reasons. And they faltered and they fell. All nations were deceived by sorcery. That word sorcery is the word pharmakeia that we find over in Galatians chapter 5. Illicit drugs and those kind of activities is nothing new. During the time of Rome, they had these the pagan temples, and they were just full of narcotics. I can't remember the one right off the top of my head, but one of the temples, maybe I'll think about it later. If I don't, I'll call you about 3 o'clock in the morning. They would had a cave that they would go into. Well, come to find out that they were having all of these visions and all of this stuff in this cave, and they had these priestesses in this cave, and they would be in there all day long. Well, come to find out, there was a gas leak in that cave. Still gas leak in that cave as far as I know. So people were utilizing those kinds of things, illicit drugs. And that's what the word means there at pharmakeia, sorcery. In her was found the blood of prophets and saints and all that would have been slain on the earth. They were murdering people right and left. And I guess we could call it wholesale murder. Could we go that far with it? If you were a Christian, they'd just take you in and either burn you alive or throw you to the critters, or they would kill you, however. So when we look at this, we see, number one, waste. We see materialism, wantonness, perversity, pride, the shedding of innocent blood. And again, we see that in our world today. Rome fell because Rome worshiped wealth. They worshiped luxury. Rome fell because Rome lived a prodigal and wanton life. Rome fell because Rome found no pleasure except in materialism and perversity. Rome fell because Rome was lifted up with pride and felt it had no need for God. And if you remember, it notes here in chapter 18 that Rome had the idea that they were like a queen, that they could do no wrong. They could do no wrong. And if you look at what Rome was, God dealt with Rome. Throughout the ages, there have been enmities, not governments, but enmities that have persecuted Christians. Even that which Rome became persecuted Christians, and still does in some instances. But the thing about it is that maybe they won't fall today, but they will reap the consequences of what they have sown throughout the ages. So something to think about when we think about our world today and the encouragement that's given to the 7 churches of Asia. Yeah, Rome's going to fall, and it's going to be bad. Now, if the Lord's willing, next Wednesday we will start chapter 19 and talk about the 4 hallelujahs.